Thank you. All right. Good morning. I will confess I struggled today on what exactly to say, so you get to see my fourth presentation. Okay? I think it's my best one of the four, but you'll be my judge. Okay? What I would like to do, though, is a little bit not talk about whether it's a revolution or an evolution, but talk about the change, maybe even from a point of view that you've seen and heard everything before. But have we really stopped to think about it in consideration of where we are, what we're accomplishing, and it's also not one of those frustration talks that sometimes you hear from this podium in terms of how are we proceeding as an industry. So let me just share a little bit how we see us fitting as an industry in the context of history, and then talk about some of the things that we're now beginning to see, because as Carol said, we're really excited by some of the traction that we're starting to see, albeit we're very clear we aren't yet to the place where we're cloud native, fully automated, AI driven, all of the nice things that we know will come in our future. Okay, so let's get into it. It shouldn't be a surprise to us as we undertake this next change that this is a little bit more involved than maybe it was at first instance. Okay? Because we're really building, as our German colleagues have dubbed it, the fourth industrial revolution. Okay? Now, there are a few things to observe, and again, like I said, you all know this. Okay? But have you really stopped to think about what each of these shifts means? Okay? Because one of the markers in my mind of what this industrial revolution shift is that actually the future does not resemble the past in any way. Okay? So if I think about what do I mean by that, think about the automobile. Going forward, everything mechanic, everything fast, no longer any need for anything like a buggy whip. Okay? These type of very stark differences mark the demarcation between it. So I ask, as we're now moving from this third to the fourth revolution, think about how much different it must be from the world that we lived in just 10 years ago. Okay? In that, are we really ready to give control over to the computer? Because that's actually what we're saying we're doing. Okay? Are we really ready for the world where everything is connected? And because we've now given control to everything, because everything's the computer, what does that mean for us? Okay? And by the way, just the description of that should give us ample indication that this is going to actually be pretty involved, pretty hard, and not happen overnight. Okay? Why it's happening and why it's happening right now, I think is an important thing to point out, because we're in the middle of it in a couple of different contexts, but it's really simple. The combination of ubiquitous gigabit bandwidth, and why is gigabit important? Because it finally lets you have a degree of instantaneity. Latency is a different issue. We'll come to that later in the 5G story, not in this talk. Okay? Massive distributed compute. Can you imagine that we're gearing up that with a combination of ubiquitous connectivity at almost unbounded levels, married to the web-scale cloud, the mainframe, the desktop, the supercomputer that we wear on our hip that we call a phone, right? Those things together actually combine to give us potentially the end, or maybe the perpetual continuation of the debate of is it centralized, decentralized, or something else. Okay? And then lastly, finally we begin to have something that we can act on with the connectivity and the compute. Namely, we've spent the last couple of decades digitizing our society, which means we finally have access to the data that defines that society, and we can now act on it. Okay? So if these are the raw materials, let us not forget that actually the fuel is the fact that everything becomes connected. If you look at some of the newest capabilities out there, ARM as an example, with integrated SIM, putting in place on the same chip, connectivity, compute, memory, all on a very low-cost form factor, gives us the ability to really imagine finally that we can connect anything that has power. Okay? What will that then in turn do for us? And as well, when we talk about anything, we have to acknowledge that as an industry, we have spent the last, 4 decades, 5 decades, connecting every human on the planet, or working to do so, right? But actually, the next generation is not about connecting the humans, although we still have that work to do, and let's get on with it. The next generation is all about connecting everything else to us, and actually making it so that the workloads that define the next efforts are actually the machine-oriented workloads, not the human-oriented workloads, okay? And that's regardless of time, distance, coverage, all of that we will intelligently manage, and we actually have the capabilities to do that, okay? And I think, these pictures that we put up on slides are sometimes a little bit misleading. Most of them are not glitzy, sexy, industrial design products. Most of these will actually be ugly sensors out in a pipe yard somewhere, managing the flow of critical oil, gas, etc. Okay? Okay. And it is global. Okay? And I put the picture of kind of our footprint and our affiliated footprint, not to make the point about, yes, we're big, but actually to make a very different point that says, sometimes we forget that we need to reorient ourselves to the customer in terms of the services that we deliver, and figure out how do you actually provide the services end-to-end ubiquitously, regardless of whether it's on your network or someone else's. Because in my mind, this is the biggest differentiator between the web scale operators and ourselves. We've gotten confused with the connectivity we provide versus the experiences that the customers demand. And the experiences that the customers demand are what pull the customers with them, okay? And in fact, if you look at the earliest stages of the industry, we were actually quite good about providing end-to-end service. It was just something that we now call a voice call. But we didn't try to go across other people's boundaries. We just handed it off and said, can you please finish it in a high-quality way? And we did that. In fact, we weren't allowed to do much else, okay? And I think that as you get forward, one of the things that I'm very excited about is a joint demo that we did at the latest ONS conference with China Mobile, where we actually did an ONAP to ONAP SD-WAN native service interface, so you could provide ubiquitously across our infrastructure and ubiquitously across theirs an end-to-end customer experience that gives full service richness across the entire fabric, okay? And maybe that's more in keeping with what the future should be, rather than continuing to pummel one another, trying to overbuild one another with just basic connectivity. Let's get on with serving our customers with rich services for which they'll actually appreciate us, okay? But I think it also means that we have to look at the global opportunity as one where we solve in aggregate and in a more collaborative fashion, but also with all of the parts of the industry participating and engaged at the service layer through APIs, through open source, and through some of the other characteristics that come from having put in the software domain the entirety of our service capability, okay? And in many ways, this is what we're about, okay? Now, let me take a quick deep breath, pause. Anything new? Probably not a lot yet, right? And like I said, this isn't about providing you stuff that you know, but actually trying to stitch it together so that we actually can start integrating and building this in a fashion that we realize this, the promise, okay? But let's be clear, on our journey, because Carol highlighted the measuring that she's been doing over the past 4 years, okay? In our journey, what we've really struggled with in a lot of cases, and frankly, still are struggling with in some areas, because of our scope and scale, we find that some areas we're beginning to solve a number of these, and others we're still struggling, so we're taking lessons back and forth, and also learning from many of you in the cloud. Technology readiness, as with any revolution, is the beginning hard place that you have to get over, okay? And we shouldn't be confused as we're just giving birth to this thing, that it's really a bit more challenging. That actually taking something from what was a very protected, isolated and hardened point of development to where we want to do it on a multi-vendor, open source, everything else that is the SDN and cloud world, getting the technology to actually be able to do that, and also recognize we have to also let Moore's Law catch up with our aspirations and ambitions. Okay? When we painted the picture a few years ago, we forgot that actually the general purpose compute wasn't quite there yet by definition. The software architectures weren't quite there yet. But I'm really excited to say on technology readiness, we're beginning in almost every instance, right? Our largest instance of the Evolve Packet Core is currently nearing a terabit capacity and operating at scale, okay? Now, we have hopes that it will scale beyond that, and we don't see particular limits to stop us at that level, and we know that that's what our customers need. Because our biggest challenge is actually the success that we have in our customers using the service to pull and aggregate more and more data to use, okay? Now, cloud maturity is something that 2 years ago we said, you know what, this network virtualization stuff isn't going to be enough because it doesn't allow us to shift the operating paradigm as well as cloud native will. Cloud native lets us truly harvest the operating characteristics that we see in the hyperscale and web scale environment and the open source environment around continuous improvement, continuous deployment, rapid evolution of functionality, and everything that DevOps gives for us. Honestly, I would put forward, you can't do that in a true virtualized world. You need to get to cloud native, okay? Now, am I saying that everything will be cloud network, cloud native? No. We believe in the world of reality, which says we'll have physical network functions, virtual network functions, and cloud network functions with the common orchestration and automation layer on top. The difference will be the cloud native will just be truly dynamic and truly real time in terms of how we manage it and be able to participate in a very different construct than what we have in the others, okay? Adoption and migration is always the hardest task. When you're learning how to serve 500 million subscribers, believe me, this is not a task of a flash cut overnight change service, okay? And those of you in the audience that are carriers or that have worked for them know what that is. It's arguing about how many cutovers can we do a week? Is it tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, right? Probably not millions unless you're really, really distributed. And so just you begin to do the math across the scale of what we've got to do and recognize that each shift, you actually want to bring a true customer benefit, which means you have to productize it, you have to serve it, and go on. So the adoption and migration task is clearly one of the biggest ones that we've got still in front of us. But as we're looking at the ramp, the number of subscribers that are now served in our network with virtual functions is ramping faster than we ever expected. Okay? And that's the nature of these big migrations. It's slower when you start. You stay flat, and it's very frustrating, right? Once you get it figured out, then actually the scale begins to tip, and we're beginning to see that, right? A big challenge that we have as well is, in many cases, we've kind of spun this as a like-for-like transformation, where the benefits are intangibles around automation and so forth, and it's not clear what the customer outcome is. So naturally, you create this situation of sense of urgency, and let me translate what that means, right? I've got certain markets where we're beginning to scale Volti fast enough that I may be completely scaled on Volti with a mixture of physical and virtual network functions before I get my cloud native in place. And that's backwards to what I wanted. But that's the reality of customer demand. So getting a sense of urgency to get there with the solutions in place, with the tooling, with the automation, so that you actually benefit from it, not have to slog through it, okay? And you know, we're all humans, so our experience, the mental models that we have is not on this path. And so we're having to replumb each of us and learn new experiences and new capabilities, and overcome that muscle memory to reorient ourselves to a cloud-native way of working, okay? Where not just infrastructure as code takes way, but actually you begin to then say cognitive drives, and you introduce AI into every complex, high-volume, high-data-oriented application. So these are the challenges that we're working on today in really driving. And hopefully it's clear, the biggest challenge here is actually only the last one on that bullet, right? The biggest challenge and the biggest need for revolution is actually in culture, okay? And this is probably really evident to many, but it always takes us longer for that to really take place. Do you remember the chart in terms of the industrial revolutions, each of them took a century, except for the last one, took 50 years. This one, we're trying to get done in about 3.5. Okay? We shouldn't be surprised. And oh, by the way, the recent journey, I remember the conversation of a year and a half or so ago. I'm like, people are like, what are you concerned about? I'm concerned that we're not virtualizing fast enough, that we're already seeing containers land, and I see, Lambda functions and everything else coming shortly behind. I can't shift and make every single leap. I have to place a bet and say, which is the dwell point? Because technology is actually moving faster than any of us can keep up with. And so that's why we're pushing ever harder for container-based cloud native, because that gives us at least a dwell point we think will endure long enough to make sense, but it finally gives us the ability to expose it to the tooling we have in some of our IT capabilities, and as well to begin to harvest a lot of the data and capabilities that we see. Because in reality, the biggest thing that we get out of this transformation eventually comes to data and insight to let us tailor our services to our customers. Okay? And that may be the biggest magic that will come out of this transformation, right? We think it's about software, we think it's about automation, all of that's true, right? We have way too much failure, way too much dwell time, way too much slowness in our industry, and that's why we need to get to the automation, okay? But we need the data to be able to run the automation and to be able to tailor the experience to the customers and to be able to actually tailor the experience so we can optimize it, because the CapEx of maintaining this industry is too high without a much finer granularity of how do we control, how do we preempt, and how do we predict profitability, okay? So I'll leave you with a quote, right? A lot of times, sometimes I think we come to these conferences and we dwell in our misery sometimes. Right? It shouldn't be a surprise that we were overly ambitious in saying how fast things were going to change. But now, as I tell you, we're beginning to see scale happen. It's really awesome to see one of our big markets come in and say, I had this huge existential problem. And I decided, can't believe much else. Let me turn to the strategy that we've been talking about and let me see if that, and it worked. Almost as a surprise. And now we're pushing nearly a terabit of exchange, right? And we know we'll get to more. So it is the case that in any meaningful large-scale change, at least in my experience, it does take longer on startup ramp. But as it takes place, the change becomes far more compelling over the coming decade. And that's what I hope that we can actually take back to our companies and say, you know what? Do this thoughtfully, do this with care, and focus on the outcome, because we've largely got them right if you're thinking about the experience, about creating and exposing your businesses and your customers to data-driven change and innovation, because that's the promise that we have, at least in my point of view. So thank you. I apologize we can't do questions. That's apparently not in this format, okay? But hopefully it's been a bit of a different shift for you, and I thank you very much and look forward to the next couple of keynotes. Thank you.